Hi, I'm Jacques Morrell and welcome to Psycho Killer. I was a copper for 30 years and a murder squad detective for 10 of them. So let's just say I've seen a few things I won't forget in a hurry. I've also spent a fair amount of time working around the historic city of Nottingham in England. When I was a rookie, there were plenty of old sweats who would mention old cases and old villains. And one that made an impression on me is the story of Dorothea-Waddingham and her lover, Ronald Sullivan. On the 24th of February 1936, they stood trial at the Shire Hall in Nottingham for murder. When I put it like that, it doesn't sound anything out of the ordinary. But there was something especially dastardly about this particular crime. Dorothea-Waddingham had picked up a smattering of medical knowledge working as a nursing auxiliary in Burton-on-Trent Infirmary, about 30 miles from Nottingham as the crow flies. While she was there, she met and married Thomas Leach, a man nearly twice her age. And in 1930, they moved to Nottingham with their 3 young children. Dorothea was still only 30, but Leach was disabled and couldn't work. So, styling herself as Nurse Waddingham, Dorothea opened a nursing home for the elderly, and it was then that she met Ronald Sullivan, a handsome man much nearer her own age and separated from his wife. Before long, he'd moved in. In June of 1933, Thomas Leach died, and soon afterwards the grieving widow and her brood, accompanied by Sullivan, moved into another nursing home, 32 Devon Drive, in the Sherwood area of Nottingham. Dorothea was now going by the name Mrs. Sullivan, and she gave birth to a 4th child. Ronald busied himself as a caretaker, doing odd jobs and sweeping up, that kind of thing. Then in January 1935, Mrs. Sullivan was asked if she could take in 2 new residents, 87-year-old Mrs. Louisa Bagley and her daughter Ada, who was 50, chronically overweight, and suffering from multiple sclerosis. Mother and daughter had been living together since the death of Mrs. Bagley's husband 6 years earlier, but old Mrs. Bagley couldn't cope anymore. They had some money, about £1,600 in cash and shares, and they could afford to pay the 30 shillings or £3 for their care. That's something like £230 today. Everything went well until after a few months Mrs. Sullivan, aka Nurse Waddingham, decided that £3 a month wasn't enough. She rang Miss Winifred Blagg of the County Nursing Association, who'd introduced the Bagleys in the first place, and suggested a deal. She said words to that effect: "They've got money, and if they turn it over to me, I'll keep them for life." Miss Blagg was taken aback by what was being suggested, and so were the Bagleys' relatives and solicitor. But Dorothea convinced them that if something wasn't done, the nursing home would have to close. And where would that leave Louisa and Ada Bagley? The stress was too much for the family, so the solicitor prepared a will for Ada, handing over all the assets to Dorothea and Sullivan, in consideration that they have undertaken to look after me and my mother for and during our joint lives. The document was signed and dated 7th of May 1935. It was a Tuesday, and by Sunday, Ada's mother, Louisa Bagley, was dead. George Herbert Manfield, the nursing home's regular physician, wrote cardiac muscular degeneration on the death certificate. But he hadn't actually been there when old Mrs. Bagley had died. No sooner than her mother was buried, poor Ada found herself completely controlled by Dorothea and Sullivan. The relatives can write to Ada, Dorothea told one of her cousins, but we open all letters, and if they are not approved, they are not given to her. On another occasion, she bluntly told a relative, "We've taken control of Ada's affairs." The family, as you can imagine, were rather put out, so they primed Ada's old doctor and a family friend, Dr. Frank Jacob, to drop by unannounced. When he visited the nursing home in August, Ada seemed happy enough, if a little distant. Another family friend, Alice Briggs, popped round for a chat on the afternoon of Tuesday the 10th of September 1935, and Ada seemed very bright, sitting in the garden, enjoying the late summer sunshine. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Ada was dead. It was just 4 months since her mother's sudden but not entirely unexpected demise, but like the last time, Dr. Manfield hadn't seen Ada before her death. "I tried to leave a message, but you were out on your rounds," Dorothea told him. "She wasn't so well yesterday. She had a heavy midday meal which seemed to upset her. So much for seeming very bright in the afternoon. About 2 o'clock this morning, she was breathing loudly and slowly. She was flushed and unconscious. Later the colour changed. I thought she was dying and I telephoned you. She was in a coma for about 4 hours." This statement of Dorothea's was presented at the inquest, which we'll talk about more later. It appears also that the police were not summoned either. Dr. Manfield examined Ada's body and wrote on the death certificate, "cerebral hemorrhage due to cardiac vascular degeneration." It's what we now call a stroke. This was consistent with Ada's medical history, her obesity, and Dorothea's account of her last hours. Dr. Manfield clearly trusted Nurse Waddingham, but he was a bit naive. He didn't even blink when Dorothea thrust a letter into his hand, signed by the dead woman, and dated the 29th of August 1935, just a fortnight before her death. The letter read, "I desire to be cremated at my death for health's sake, and it's my wish to remain with the nurse, and my last wish is my relatives shall not know of my death." This letter was witnessed R.J. Sullivan. Dear old Dr. Manfield dutifully signed the cremation certificate, got another doctor to countersign it, and presented the papers at Nottingham Crematorium, where they landed on the desk of Mr. Cyril Banks, the crematorium's medical referee, and he smelled a rat. The letter was worded very oddly indeed. It seemed to be in the same handwriting as the witness, R.J. Sullivan, and the signature on it was barely legible. Dr. Banks lifted the receiver of his telephone and asked to be put through to the Nottingham City coroner, Wilfred Rotherer. An immediate post-mortem examination of Ada's body was ordered. 2 pathologists carried out the autopsy that afternoon, with Dr. Manfield watching. It was, of course, too soon to determine the exact cause of death, as the organs had to be sent away for analysis. But it was clear that Ada Bagley had not died of a stroke. They gave a preliminary verdict as death due to failure of her heart, brought on by pneumonia. So what was the mysterious cause of pneumonia? After all, the day before her death, Ada had been soaking up the rays in the garden. The lab test found the answer. Ada's organs contained more than 5 grains, or 323 milligrams, of morphia. That's morphine in today's parlance. With Ada's catalogue of health conditions, that amount was more than enough to bring on a coma, which might well cause pneumonia. This accounted for the autopsy's final report, death by morphia poisoning. William Rotherer opened an inquest. Nurse Waddingham was apparently now too ill to give evidence. She was expecting her 5th child. So a detective inspector paid her a visit. Dorothea vehemently denied giving morphia to Ada Bagley. The only time she had the drug on the premises was for 2 previous patients, and she'd none left after they'd died. And what about the strange cremation letter? "Mr. Sullivan made it out at Miss Bagley's request and she signed it," Dorothea told the detective. Sullivan confirmed this. The police searched the premises. They found no morphia, but they were a tenacious lot, the old Nottingham City police. They got an exhumation order for Miss Louisa Bagley's body. And guess what? She'd been poisoned with morphia too. Much as the police would have liked to have put this new evidence to Dorothea, she was giving birth, and it was several weeks before she'd sufficiently recovered to be questioned. And when they did question her, she became hysterical. "I know there is no morphia in Mrs. Bagley," she protested. "I reckon this is a put-up job." She even mentioned a woman called Rose who used to come and visit Ada. She'd seen Ada pay her money too. The police checked, and there was no person called Rose. So, could it be that Sullivan was the culprit, and he was framing his partner Dorothea? "To my knowledge, there was no morphia kept in Mrs. Bagley's room," he told the police. So where did it come from? Mansfield had once prescribed a tiny amount as a painkiller for Ada, but the pain was all that killed. There was far too little of it to see off a human being, even a poorly one. Dorothea then suggested that the pharmacy had made a mistake, but that was nigh on impossible. So where in blazes had the morphia come from? Maybe the bumbling Dr. Mansfield had made a mistake. His record-keeping left a lot to be desired. It was all very odd, but the evidence was just circumstantial. There wasn't enough hard evidence to make an arrest, and it was stalemate once again. The inquest into Ada Bagley's death resumed on the 15th of January 1936. Dr. Mansfield was in the witness box, and his testimony lasted an agonising 8 hours. At the end of it, his professional reputation was in shreds. Wilfred Rotherer, the Nottingham City coroner, savaged the hapless doctor, but William Smith, representing Dorothea, went easy on him. He just tried to show that his client had accounted for all the morphia prescribed for her 2 previous patients. Now, one of the first things I did as a rookie was to attend the coroner's inquest, and I was slightly surprised that the coroner asked most of the questions. It seemed quite relaxed, nothing like as intimidating as the Crown or the Magistrates' Court at all. Another curiosity about the coroner's inquest, in England at least, proceedings might well be different from where you are, is that nobody can be forced to incriminate themselves. You can't be compelled to give evidence. This meant dorothea-waddingham could have refused to give evidence at the inquest into Ada Bagley's death. It would have looked bad, of course, but as one of the veterans at the police social club used to put it, we'd never been able to pin it on her if she hadn't. The thing was, she did give evidence, and it was, to quote the esteemed crime writer Fenton Bresler, a calamitous mistake. Dorothea-Waddingham spent 4.5 hours on the witness stand, during which she effectively convicted herself of murder out of her own mouth. Her undoing was a single stupid lie. She came up with another explanation of how the morphia got into Ada Bagley's body. "I gave it to her," she told the hearing. "I gave it to her in 2 doses of 5 tablets each." "But why? And where did it come from?" "Dr. Mansfield told me to do it. He left me 6 tablets when he called in August and 4 more in early September. He told me to give them to her when the pain was bad. I gave the last 2 at 8 o'clock on the night she died." Now, if Thomas Pierpont, the hangman, had heard this, he'd have started packing his black execution box, because apart from the fact that Dorothea needn't have said anything, she'd already sworn a statement to the police that she'd never given morphia to Miss Bagley. Dr. Mansfield had sworn that he'd never prescribed morphia for Ada. Now, he was incompetent for sure, but why would he lie? And William Smith, Dorothea's counsel, hadn't put it to Dr. Mansfield under cross-examination. Why not? Obviously, because they didn't know that Dorothea-Waddingham was going to make such an accusation. Her testimony descended into farce, and a black farce at that. Pressed by Rotherer about why she'd said nothing to the police or the court about Ada's morphia tablets, Dorothea replied, "Dr. Mansfield told me not to." Now, this was ridiculous in the circumstances, even given Dr. Mansfield's untidy approach to general practice. Professionally, he was sunk, but he had plenty of character witnesses who'd say that he couldn't possibly have lied or told somebody else to do so. There must have been quite an atmosphere in that courtroom when Dorothea-Waddingham left the stand. Next up, Ronald Sullivan. He declined the invitation to give evidence. "I don't think it is necessary," he told the coroner, but he couldn't escape the fallout from what Dorothea had said. The jury's verdict was that Ada Louise Bagley was murdered by Ronald Joseph Sullivan and Dorothea Nancy Waddingham. Dorothea screamed as constables from Nottingham City Police put handcuffs on both of them. There was an initial court hearing and the case was committed to the Crown Court. At the full trial, the judge was Mr. Justice Goddard, and Norman Burkitt KC appeared for the Crown. Towards the end of the trial, Dr. Frank Jacob, Ada's old doctor, was asked about his visits to 32 Devon Drive, and if you saw her in such a condition or complaining of any pain, such as a doctor would think it right to administer morphia to her. "She never complained to me of any such pain," replied Dr. Jacob. Here was an independent doctor saying on oath that Ada's multiple sclerosis, and they called it creeping paralysis in the 1930s, didn't justify treatment with morphia. Once Norman Burkitt had closed the prosecution case, Goddard questioned what evidence there was against Sullivan. The prosecution hadn't really presented any direct evidence that he was involved in possessing or administering morphia, so the charges against him were dropped, and he was immediately released. Now Sullivan must have breathed a huge sigh of relief at that dramatic moment. The next day, the jury delivered its verdict on Dorothea-Waddingham. Guilty, but with a strong recommendation for mercy because of her 5 children. Nevertheless, Mr. Justice Goddard sentenced her to death. "I'm innocent," she was heard to whisper as she was taken down. Now in the UK, we haven't hanged murderers since the 1960s, and even before the Second World War, the authorities were reluctant to hang a woman. Surely with 5 children and a feeding newborn baby, the state wouldn't execute her, would they? But Dorothea's luck had run out. The Home Secretary, Sir John Simon, was on record as saying, "Don't expect me to reprieve a murderer merely because she is a woman." Apparently, poisoners were traditionally almost never reprieved. Waddingham's appeal was dismissed, as was her petition to have the death sentence commuted. At 9 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday the 16th of April 1936, Dorothea-Waddingham went to the gallows at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. We don't know if they had to tear her 6-month-old baby daughter from her arms. 12,000 people gathered outside the gates, many of them protesting against the death penalty. But Thomas Pierpont, the executioner, had a job to do. And do it he did. And that was just about that. The children were split up and placed with foster families. Ronald Sullivan stayed at 32 Devon Drive for a time, then moved on, but not before he was awarded a half share of Ada's inheritance, which strikes me, and I'm sure it would you, as inappropriate, given that her will was either a forgery or written under duress. Okay, was the woman Thomas Pierpont executed that spring morning a psychopath? Well, Dorothea-Waddingham certainly showed some of the telltale signs. We need to look no further than her performance at the inquest to realise that she was a pathological liar. Plus, she showed a singular lack of remorse or guilt. It's clear she was cunning and probably manipulated Sullivan into acting against his better nature. Was her initial hysteria just for effect, putting on a show for the gallery, so to speak? I doubt that her hand-wringing and righteous indignation was genuine, do you? Her first marriage to a much older man, taking up with a younger lover under his nose, suggests a parasitic lifestyle, as does her willingness to milk the vulnerable, the Bagleys, of their money, and ultimately to murder them both to get their hands on the lot. Dorothea-Waddingham certainly failed to take responsibility for her own actions, blaming everyone and anyone around her, fabricating a story about the visitor named Rose to cover her tracks. I don't need to go any further, do I? Dorothea-Waddingham was a copper-bottomed blue-chip psychopath, if there ever was one. I also think Dr. Manfield got off lightly, though. He was slipshod and lazy. If he'd been on the ball and less inclined to believe Nurse Waddingham, he might have noticed something odd about Mrs. Bagley's death, and maybe saved Ada from the same fate. Lots of people may have stood up to say that he was a decent bloke, just a bit bumbling, but that wouldn't wash today, would it? He'd be keel-hauled. But then, it's the 1930s. People were inclined to believe that doctor knows best. The man, and it was almost always a man, with the black bag and the stethoscope, was beyond reproach. It was another physician who was to blow that misconception to smithereens 2 generations later, also born in Nottingham. Just up the road from 32 Devon Drive, on the 14th of January 1946. His name, Frederick Harold Shipman. That's maybe a story for a future podcast. Thanks for listening to Psycho Killer. We're as mad about true crime as you are, and it's thirsty work, you know. So, why not head over to buymeacoffee.com and search Psycho Pals. I can't promise I'd spend it on a coffee though. Once a copper, always a copper. I'll see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.